You have to understand, in a town like Redemption Creek, some things are better left unsaid, especially in 1873. The Arizona sun doesn't just bake the dirt roads. It bakes secrets into the very soul of the place. Secrets fester. They rot from the inside out. And sometimes the only one who can smell the decay is a dusty little lapdog. Her name was Glenda Ruth, and she was only 22 years old. But she walked like she was 100, her shoulders hunched under the weight of something no one could see. She'd drift through town like a ghost, her faded red dress trailing in the dust. And right behind her, always, was this little terrier, a scruffy thing, brown and white, that the townsfolk had nicknamed Buttons. Buttons never played. He never chased lizards or barked at wagons. His entire world was Glenda Ruth. He'd circle her, his nose twitching, letting out these low, pitiful whimpers. He'd press his body against her legs, frantically licking at the hem of her skirt. He was trying to clean something. Something dark. Something foul. "It hurts when I sit," Glenda would whisper to herself, her voice so soft it was swallowed by the desert wind. She thought no one could hear her, but Buttons heard. He licked and licked, trying to lick away the pain, trying to lick away the dark, sticky discharge that sometimes dripped down her legs. The town saw it. Of course they saw it. They just chose to look away. Maudie Clark, the general storekeeper's wife, would watch from her window, her hands twisting in her apron. "It's like it smells something rotten on her," she'd mutter to her husband, Alvin. Alvin wouldn't even look up from his ledger. "Ain't our business, Maudie. Father McKenna says the girl's touched in the head. Says she's got demons." And that was that. In Redemption Creek, what Father McKenna said was gospel. He was their shepherd, a tall, silver-haired man with a voice that could soothe a crying baby or condemn a sinner to hellfire. He said Glenda Ruth was wrestling with demons, and the town nodded and prayed for her soul. They whispered that she talked to herself down by the creek, that she cried tears of blood. They dismissed it all as the workings of a troubled mind. But the dog, they couldn't explain the dog. That constant, desperate circling, that frantic licking. It was unnatural. It was a sign. But a sign of what? They were about to find out. Because a stranger had just ridden into town. A man who knew the smell of death better than anyone. A man who didn't look away. His name was Chester Ray, and he'd come to Redemption Creek to forget the horrors of war. A former cavalry scout, he'd seen things that would turn a man's soul to dust. He'd bought the old Murphy place at the edge of town, content to fix fences and watch the sunset. He wanted peace, but peace wasn't what he found. He was sitting on his porch one evening, the sky bleeding purple and orange, when he saw Glenda Ruth making her slow, painful way up the steps of St. Mary's Catholic Church for evening prayers. Her dog, Buttons, was going absolutely frantic. He wasn't just whimpering now, he was barking. Sharp, desperate yaps that echoed off the church walls like gunshots. He clawed at her dress, trying to pull her back, trying to stop her from going inside. It was a level of agitation Chester had never seen in any animal. It was pure, unadulterated terror. And that's when Chester saw it. His scout's eye, trained to spot a broken twig or a puff of dust on the horizon, caught the detail everyone else had missed. As Glenda climbed the steps, the fading sunlight caught the back of her dress. A dark stain, wet and ugly, was seeping through the fabric. It was spreading down her legs, slow and viscous, like spilled wine. Or worse, like blood. He watched her enter the church, her face a mask of agony. He saw her force herself to sit on the hard wooden pew, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the backrest in front of her. She bit her lips so hard he was sure it would bleed. This wasn't a woman wrestling with demons in her mind. This was a woman in physical pain, excruciating pain. And then he saw Father McKenna. The priest moved down the aisle, his silver hair glowing like a halo in the candlelight. He placed a hand on Glenda's shoulder. It was meant to be a comforting gesture. But Chester saw her flinch, a violent, uncontrollable shudder, as if she'd been touched by a hot poker. She shrank into herself, making herself smaller, trying to disappear. Chester Ray had seen that look before. He'd seen it in the eyes of captured soldiers, in the faces of women who had survived raids on their homesteads. It wasn't madness. It was fear. The kind of fear that gets carved into your bones. The kind of fear you feel when your predator is wearing the mask of a saint. Chester's blood ran cold. He hadn't come to Redemption Creek looking for a fight, but a fight had just found him. The battle wasn't on some dusty plain against a painted warrior. It was right here, in God's own house. And the enemy was wearing a collar. Chester couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the stain on Glenda's dress, the terror in her eyes. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture so ugly he could barely stand to look at it. He was a man trained to observe, to track, to understand the landscape. And right now, all his instincts were screaming that Glenda Ruth was prey. So he started watching. From a distance, of course. He wasn't some creep. He was a scout gathering intelligence. He saw her daily routine, the slow, pained walk through town, the visit to the general store where she barely spoke, and every evening, like clockwork, she would go to the church for prayers. After the service, after everyone else had gone home to their families, Father McKenna would often keep her behind for what he called private counseling. He told the town she needed special prayers to fight her demons. Chester didn't buy it for a second. One evening, he decided to follow her after one of these counseling sessions. She didn't go home. Instead, she limped her way out of town towards the old abandoned mining shack by the creek. The place was a ruin, its walls gray and splintered. It was there, sitting on a fallen log, that she finally let herself break. She wept, not loudly, but in shuddering, silent sobs that shook her entire body. The little dog, Buttons, whined and licked at her ankles, his tongue working frantically, as if he could clean away the source of her pain. Chester hid behind a thicket of sagebrush, about 50 yards away. The desert wind carried her words to him, a prayer spoken in hell. "Mama," she whispered, her voice raw with grief, "if you can hear me in heaven, please make it stop. He says it's God's will, that I'm chosen for this suffering, that it's a test of my faith. But I can't bear it anymore. The pain, I think I'm dying inside. The dog knows. Buttons knows what that holy man does to me. Behind the altar, when everyone else goes home." The world went silent. Chester felt a rage so cold and pure, it burned like ice in his veins. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles cracking in the quiet. Father McKenna, the town's moral compass, the man they trusted with their children, their confessions, their very souls. He was the demon. He was the wolf. Chester's mind flashed back. Mary Sullivan, the girl who threw herself down the old mine shaft last spring. They'd called it a tragedy, a fit of melancholy. Catherine Muller, who vanished one night, leaving a note saying she was joining a convent in California. Her parents had seemed relieved. How many more? How many girls had this monster destroyed, using God's name as his shield? He was using their faith as a weapon, twisting it into a cage to keep them silent and ashamed. He made them believe their suffering was holy, that their violation was a form of purification. It was brilliant. It was diabolical. And it had to end. Tonight. But how? He was one man, an outsider, against a priest who held the entire town in the palm of his hand. Accusing Father McKenna would be like accusing God himself. They'd run him out of town on a rail, or worse, he needed proof. He needed an ally. And just as that thought crossed his mind, a lantern flickered to life not 20 feet from him. Someone else was out here. Someone else was watching. A figure stepped out from behind the crumbling wall of the old stamp mill. It was a woman holding a lantern high. Chester instinctively reached for the Colt Navy at his hip before he recognized her. Leola James, the town doctor's daughter. She'd just returned from nursing school back east, a place like Boston, full of new ideas and sharp edges that hadn't yet been worn down by the frontier. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at Glenda, her face a mixture of pity and a kind of clinical fury. "I knew it," she said, her voice tight with anger. Chester stepped out from the sagebrush. "You've been watching her too?" Leola jumped, spinning around, the lantern light dancing wildly. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Mr. Ray, you startled me." She lowered the lantern, her gaze returning to the weeping girl by the creek. "Yes, I've been watching. I'm a nurse. You learn to see things." The way she walks, the wincing when she sits. I saw her at the church social last week. I noticed stains on her undergarments. She looked at Chester, her eyes hard. It's not a sickness, it's an injury, the kind that comes from repeated assault. The word hung in the cold night air, ugly and sharp. I tried to talk to her, Leola continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. I offered to help, to examine her. She was terrified. She recoiled like I tried to brand her. Said Father McKenna told her the pain was a test from God, that to speak of it would be a sin. Chester nodded grimly. I just heard her myself. She said he does things to her. In the church, after everyone leaves. Leola's face hardened into a mask of determination. Tonight, I saw him beckon her inside after the social. There was a look in his eye. It made my skin crawl. I made an excuse, went back to the church to get my medical bag. I looked through the side window. Her voice broke for a second, but she swallowed and pushed on. I saw enough. I saw his hands. I heard his whispers. He's a monster. They stood in silence for a moment, two outsiders bound by a terrible secret. The weight of it was immense. They were up against a man who was more than a man. He was an institution, an icon of piety that the town had built up for a decade. What do we do? Leola asked, her voice barely audible over the chirping of the crickets. Who would ever believe us? We're newcomers. He's Father McKenna. Before Chester could answer, a third voice rumbled out of the darkness behind them, a voice thick with a pain that had been buried for years. I believe you. A massive shape detached itself from the shadows of the mill. It was Claude Harmon, the town blacksmith, a man whose arms were as thick as railroad ties and whose face was usually set in a quiet, sorrowful mask. He stepped into the lantern light, and Chester could see the glint of tears in his eyes. Because he did the same thing to my little sister, Claude growled, his voice a low, dangerous thunder. Rebecca, 5 years ago. She was only 14. The blacksmith's hands, powerful enough to bend steel, clenched into fists at his sides. She threw herself off Devil's Canyon, left a note, said she was too dirty to live, too sinful to face God. I never understood. I thought it was just a darkness in her soul. He looked at Chester and Leola, his face a portrait of agony and dawning, horrific comprehension. But it wasn't her soul that was dark. It was his. The confession hung in the air, connecting the past to the present, one tragedy to another. This wasn't just about Glenda anymore. This was about Rebecca, about Mary Sullivan, about Catherine Muller. It was about a pattern of evil that had been allowed to fester in the heart of their town for years. Chester looked at Leola, then at Claude, the scout, the nurse, and the blacksmith. An unlikely alliance forged in the dark by a shared and terrible truth. Then we end this, Chester said, his voice quiet, but with the unyielding finality of a rock slide. Not with whispers, not with accusations. We end this with proof, the kind of proof that puts a man in chains or in the ground. Their secret council of 3 met in the abandoned flour mill, the sound of the creek rushing past the broken wheel covering their words. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, a fitting atmosphere for the business at hand. They were no longer just trying to save a single girl. They were hunting a serial predator. He's clever, Chester said, pacing the grimy floor. He chooses his victims carefully, girls who are alone, orphans, widows, girls with no family to stand up for them. Glenda's parents died of fever 2 years back. She has no one. Rebecca's parents were already gone when he started on her, Claude added, his voice a low rumble. She lived with our elderly aunt, who was half blind and trusted the father completely. It's a pattern, Leola confirmed, her mind working with the cold logic of a diagnostician. He isolates them. He uses their faith and their grief to gain their trust, then twists it to ensure their silence. He makes them complicit in their own abuse, convincing them it's a holy act. She looked from Chester to Claude, her expression grim. But I think it's worse than we imagined. I don't think Glenda is his only current victim. A chill went through the mill that had nothing to do with the night air. What do you mean? Chester asked. Maddie Clark's niece, Leola said. Sarah, she's 13. Her parents died in the cholera outbreak last year. She's been living with the Clarks. I've seen Maddie taking her to the church for special lessons with the priest every Tuesday evening. The girl has the same look in her eyes, that same haunted, hollowed-out expression. Dear God in heaven, a child. The realization landed like a physical blow. The urgency of their mission exploded. They weren't just seeking justice for past crimes. They were in a race against time to prevent a fresh atrocity. We need to catch him in the act, Leola said, her voice steely, with a witness who can't be questioned. And we need to get Glenda and Sarah away from him to document their injuries. Chester's military mind took over. Okay, here's the plan. We need to know his routine inside and out. Claude, you know this town better than anyone. I need you to watch the church, but discreetly, from your smithy, from the saloon. Note who comes and goes, especially after hours. Leola, you need to find a way to get to Glenda. Offer her some tonic for female complaints. Anything to get her alone so you can perform an examination. We need medical evidence. And you? Claude asked. I'm going to do what I do best, Chester said. I'm going to track my target. I'll watch the priest's residence. I'll follow him. I'll learn his habits, his weaknesses. Somewhere, he'll make a mistake, and when he does, we'll be there. As they were about to part ways, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place, so horrifying it made them all stop dead. Claude was looking at the little terrier, Buttons, who had followed Glenda to the shack and now sat by the mill entrance, as if standing guard. That dog, Claude said slowly, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrible memory. I've seen that dog before. Everyone has, Leola said. He follows Glenda everywhere. No, Claude insisted, shaking his head. Before that, years ago, that was Rebecca's dog. She raised him from a pup. He ran off after she died. We all thought a coyote got him. The implication was staggering. The dog hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. He hadn't chosen Glenda at random. He had belonged to another of McKenna's victims. He had run away in grief, astray in the desert, until one day he must have caught a scent. The same scent of sickness, of fear, of the predator himself, lingering on a new victim. The dog wasn't just a loyal companion. He was a living witness, a ghost from the past, drawn back by the same evil. He was trying, in the only way he knew how, to stop it from happening again. The discovery solidified their resolve into something unbreakable. They weren't just fighting for the living, they were fighting for the dead, for Rebecca, for her dog, for every soul this man had crushed under the weight of his false piety. The plan was no longer just a plan, it was a promise, a vow sealed in the darkness, to be fulfilled in the light. The next few days were a blur of tense surveillance. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every whisper a potential discovery. Chester became a ghost, melting into the alleyways and rooftops of Redemption Creek. He watched Father McKenna's every move, noting the false smiles, the overly familiar touches with the women of his flock, the way his eyes would linger a moment too long on the young and the vulnerable. The man was a master of his craft, a predator perfectly camouflaged in the sacred vestments of his office. Claude, from the fiery heart of his blacksmith shop, became their eyes on the church itself. He saw young Sarah being led in for her special lessons and saw her stumble out an hour later, her face pale and her eyes vacant. He had to physically restrain himself, his hands gripping his hammer until his knuckles were white, the urge to storm the church and end it right there, a burning fire in his chest. But he held back. For Rebecca. For justice. Leola faced the most dangerous task. She had to get to Glenda. She approached her in the general store, her voice calm and professional. Glenda, she said gently, I've prepared a special tonic for female weakness. My father and I have found it helps with pain and discomfort. Glenda flinched, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. No, thank you, Miss James. Father McKenna, he gives me all the healing I need, through prayer. Prayer is powerful, Leola said, refusing to back down. But God also gave us knowledge of herbs and medicine to heal the body. This is a gift from God, too. Please, let me help you. She pressed a small bottle into Glenda's hand. Just try it. If you need anything at all, my door is always open. It was a small seed, but it was planted. Leola could only hope it would take root in the barren ground of Glenda's fear. That night, Leola saw a flicker of movement outside her father's clinic. It was Glenda, a shawl pulled over her head, moving like a phantom in the moonlight. She hesitated at the door for a long moment before finally, desperately, knocking. Inside, Leola's examination confirmed their worst fears. The evidence of brutal, repeated trauma was undeniable. The infections, the scarring. It was a miracle the girl was still on her feet. Leola carefully documented everything, her hands shaking with a mixture of rage and sorrow. She cleaned and dressed the wounds, providing the first real medical care Glenda had likely ever received for her injuries. He told me, Glenda whispered, tears streaming down her face, that the pain was me absorbing the sins of the town, that my body was a sacred vessel for purification. He said I was a martyr, like the saints. Leola's heart broke. He lied, Glenda. He is not a man of God. He is a criminal. But we're going to stop him. You are so brave. Do you understand me? You are a survivor. For the first time, a tiny spark of something other than fear flickered in Glenda's eyes. It was hope. Meanwhile, Chester's surveillance paid off. He discovered that McKenna wasn't just acting on impulse. He was methodical. He kept a ledger, not of town business, but a small leather-bound book hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his study. Chester, using skills he'd learned picking locks on Confederate supply caches, slipped into the priest's residence while McKenna was presiding over a funeral. What he found made his blood freeze. The book was a detailed journal, written in a precise, elegant script. It listed names, dozens of them. Names of girls and young women from Redemption Creek and from two other towns before it, Silver Hill and Providence Gulch. Next to each name were dates and chilling, coded notes about their purification and spiritual progress. Mary Sullivan, Catherine Muller, Rebecca Harmon. They were all there. It was a catalog of his atrocities, a timeline of his evil stretching back a decade. This was it. This was the proof they needed. This was the nail for his coffin. But as Chester was about to slip the book into his coat, he heard a sound. The front door of the rectory was opening. The funeral must have ended early. McKenna was back. Chester was trapped. Chester's heart hammered against his ribs. There was no way out the front. The window was his only option. He moved silently, replacing the floorboard and the rug in a single, fluid motion. He slid the ledger into his jacket just as Father McKenna's footsteps entered the adjoining room. The priest was humming a hymn, the sound a grotesque counterpoint to the chilling reality of the book pressed against Chester's chest. He slipped through the open window and dropped into the thick bushes below, just as McKenna entered the study. Chester didn't breathe. He lay perfectly still, the branches scratching his face, as the priest moved about the room. He heard the man pour a drink, the clink of glass on a decanter. Seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, the lamp in the study was extinguished, and the priest's footsteps receded up the stairs to his bedroom. Chester waited another 10 minutes, his body coiled like a spring, before silently extracting himself from the bushes and melting back into the night. He met Leola and Claude at the mill, the ledger held out like a holy relic. When he explained what it was, Claude let out a ragged sob and had to turn away, his massive shoulders shaking. Leola took the book, her nurse's hands turning the pages with a kind of horrified reverence. "My God," she whispered, seeing the names, the dates, the cold clinical documentation of his crimes. He kept records, like a scientist studying insects. "This is enough," Claude said, his voice raw. "We take this to the town council. We show them." "No," Chester said firmly. "Not yet. You heard what Leola said about who would believe us. Some of these men on the council are his staunchest defenders. They'd say we forged it. They'd warn him. He'd burn the evidence and disappear, only to set up shop in another town. We have one shot at this, and it has to be perfect." "So what do we do?" Leola asked, closing the book. The thing felt profane in her hands. "We accelerate the plan," Chester said. "He's getting bolder. Taking on a second victim while still abusing Glenda shows he thinks he's untouchable. We catch him in the act with Sarah, and when the town comes running, we present them with this. He tapped the ledger. The testimony of a child, the medical evidence from Glenda, and his own damn confession written in his own hand. No one can argue with that. A new thought, cold and sharp, pierced the rage. Chester, Leola began, you said he came back from a funeral. Who died? Old man Hemlock, Chester replied, fell off his roof. That's the third unexpected death of an elderly man in the last 6 months, Leola mused, her brow furrowed. All of them prominent members of the congregation, all of them leaving substantial ties to the church in their wills. Wills that Father McKenna helped them draw up. A new, even more sinister layer of the priest's depravity was beginning to reveal itself. He wasn't just a predator of the young. He was a vulture, circling the old and infirm, manipulating them for their money. This man's evil had no bottom. The next day was Tuesday, Sarah's day for her special lesson. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the sky turning a bruised purple. It was the perfect cover. Tonight, Chester said, his voice grim, it ends tonight. They made their preparations. Leela sent a coded message via the afternoon stagecoach to the territorial marshal in Prescott, a man she'd corresponded with about medical matters. It was a long shot, but she told him a plague of a spiritual nature had taken root in Redemption Creek, and that his presence was urgently requested. Claude sharpened a spare branding iron until it gleamed, not for its intended purpose, but as a tool of intimidation. Chester cleaned his Colt Navy, the clicks of the cylinder spinning, sounding like a death rattle in the quiet of his cabin. As dusk fell, the storm broke. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, and thunder cracked overhead like the sky was splitting apart. The wind howled, a symphony for the vengeance that was about to unfold. Through the downpour, they saw Maudie Clark hurry her young niece, Sarah, toward the church, a small umbrella barely protecting them from the deluge. A few minutes later, Maudie scurried back home alone, leaving the child in the clutches of the monster. The trap was set. The bait was taken. It was time for the hunters to move in. The three of them converged on the church, hidden by the fury of the storm. The stained glass windows, usually so welcoming, now looked like the eyes of a demon, glowing ominously in the dark. Claude took up a position by the heavy oak front doors, his massive frame ready to bar any escape. Leola went to a side entrance near the rectory, her medical bag in hand, ready to tend to Sarah. Chester, moving with the lethal grace of a panther, circled around to the window of the priest's private study, the same window he'd escaped through just the night before. He peered through the glass, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The scene inside was just as he'd feared. Father McKenna was there, his back to the window, and little Sarah, her face pale with terror, was standing before him. The priest was speaking in his low, soothing voice, the same voice he used from the pulpit, but the words were a twisted mockery of Scripture. He was talking about purity, about sacrifice, about the special honor God had bestowed upon her. He reached out a hand to touch her shoulder. That was the signal. Chester gave a low whistle, and Claude put his shoulder to the front doors. The old wood groaned and splintered as the lock gave way. With a crash that was almost lost in a clap of thunder, the doors burst open. McKenna spun around, his face a mask of shock and fury. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he bellowed, his voice losing its holy cadence and taking on the snarl of a cornered animal. "The meaning," Claude growled, stepping into the church, dripping wet and looking like an avenging angel forged in fire and steel, "is Rebecca Harmon." The priest's face went white. He knew that name. As McKenna was distracted by Claude, Chester burst in through the study door, his Colt Navy drawn and leveled at the priest's chest. "It's over, McKenna." But the priest was a cornered rat, and cornered rats are the most dangerous. With a speed that belied his age, he grabbed Sarah, pulling her in front of him as a shield. From the folds of his cassock, he produced a small silver derringer and pressed it to the child's head. "Blasphemers!" he shrieked, his eyes wild with a righteous, insane fire. "You interfere with God's holy work. This child is a vessel. Through her, I cleanse the sins of this entire town. It is a sacred duty." Leola, entering from the side, froze in horror. Sarah was crying, her small body trembling. "Let her go, you monster," Leola pleaded. "She is not being harmed. She is being elevated," McKenna raved, his delusion in full bloom. "Just like the others. They were all chosen. They bear the sacred burden so that the rest of you may live in grace. I am the instrument of divine will." His blasphemous rant was cut short by an unexpected blur of brown and white fur. Buttons. The little dog, who must have slipped in when the doors crashed open, shot across the floor like a cannonball. He launched himself at McKenna's leg, sinking his teeth deep into the priest's ankle. McKenna screamed in pain and surprise, his focus momentarily broken. It was the opening Chester needed. He didn't fire his gun. A stray shot could hit the girl. Instead, he lunged forward, using the butt of his revolver to strike the priest's wrist. The derringer clattered to the floor. In the same motion, Chester shoved the priest away from Sarah, sending him stumbling back. Claude was on him in an instant, his massive hands grabbing the front of McKenna's cassock and lifting him bodily off the floor. He slammed the priest against the wall, the impact shaking a crucifix hanging nearby. "This is for my sister, you devil," Claude roared, his voice echoing through the nave like the wrath of God. Leola rushed to Sarah, scooping the terrified, sobbing child into her arms and carrying her away from the violence. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice a rock of calm in the chaos. "You're safe now. It's all over." Just then, the splintered front doors were thrown open again. Standing there, rain plastering his duster to his shoulders, was a tall man with a silver badge pinned to his chest and a shotgun held at the ready. "Territorial Marshal Davidson," he announced, his eyes taking in the scene. "I got a message about a plague. Looks like I found the source." Marshal Davidson was not a man easily surprised. He'd been tracking whispers and rumors about Father McKenna for the better part of 2 years, following a ghostly trail of missing girls and unexplained suicides that stretched across 3 territories. The problem was, McKenna was slippery. He was respected, protected by the church hierarchy, and he always moved on before the whispers could grow into accusations. Leola's cryptic telegram had been the final piece he needed, a sign that someone inside the latest town was finally ready to fight back. As Claude held the sputtering priest against the wall, Davidson stepped forward, his eyes cold as a winter sky. "Michael O'Connell," the marshal said, using a name that made the priest flinch, "also known as Father Thomas of Silver Hill and Father John of Providence Gulch. Your tour of the territories is officially over." McKenna, his face a mess of blood and righteous fury, spat on the floor. "You are condemning your own souls. I was doing God's work." "God's work?" Chester said, stepping forward and holding up the leather-bound ledger. "You call this God's work?" He opened it and began to read the names aloud. Rebecca Harmon, Mary Sullivan, Catherine Muller, Sarah Jenkins, Emily White. With each name, a fresh wave of shock rippled through the small crowd of townspeople who had been drawn by the commotion and were now huddled at the back of the church, their faces pale in the lantern light. The wall of denial that had protected McKenna for a decade shattered into a million pieces. They saw him now for what he was, not a shepherd, but a ravenous wolf. Alvin Burke, the storekeeper who had been so quick to dismiss his wife's concerns, looked like he was going to be sick. Maudie Clark pushed through the crowd and ran to her niece, wrapping her in her arms and weeping with guilt and relief. Marshal Davidson took the ledger from Chester, his eyes scanning the pages. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "He kept a record. This is enough to see you hang from the highest tree in Prescott." He pulled a set of iron shackles from his belt and snapped them onto McKenna's wrists. The definitive, metallic click echoed in the suddenly silent church. Justice had arrived. As the marshal led the disgraced priest away, still ranting about divine missions and chosen vessels, the full, ugly truth began to spill out. A woman stepped forward, then another. Hesitantly at first, then with growing strength, they began to speak. Stories of private counseling sessions that felt wrong, of confessions that were twisted into tools of manipulation, of a creeping dread they had been too afraid to name. The town of Redemption Creek was forced to look at the evil that had been festering in its heart, an evil they had ignored, enabled, and cloaked in piety. In the midst of the chaos, Glenda Ruth arrived, drawn by the noise. She saw McKenna in chains, and for a moment, she just stood there, her hand covering her mouth. The invisible wounds she had carried for so long were finally brought into the light. Chester went to her side, not touching her, but just standing there, a quiet, solid presence. "It's over, Glenda," he said softly. "He can't hurt you anymore." Slowly, a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, but for the first time in years, it wasn't a tear of pain or fear. It was a tear of release, and at her feet, the little dog Buttons, his life's mission finally complete, sat down, wagged his tail, and let out a soft, happy bark. The storm outside had passed, and inside the church, a different kind of storm was just beginning to clear, leaving behind a silence filled with the promise of a new dawn. The trial of Michael O'Connell, the man they had known as Father McKenna, was swift and decisive. The evidence was overwhelming. Leola's meticulous medical records, Chester's discovery of the ledger, and the powerful, tearful testimonies of Glenda Ruth, young Sarah, and half a dozen other women from Redemption Creek and the surrounding territories painted a portrait of a monster whose depravity knew no bounds. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in the territorial prison at Yuma, a fate many considered worse than hanging. Back in Redemption Creek, the healing was a much slower process. The church elders, mortified by the deception they had allowed to fester, issued a public apology. They sent for a new priest, a young, earnest man from Mexico named Father Martinez, who was everything McKenna had only pretended to be: humble, compassionate, and truly dedicated to his flock. He spent his first few months not in the pulpit, but in the homes of his parishioners, listening, counseling, and helping to rebuild the shattered trust. Under Leola's care, Glenda began her long journey back to health. The physical wounds started to heal, the infections subsiding under proper medical treatment. The little dog Buttons seemed to sense the change. His anxious, frantic energy disappeared, replaced by the happy-go-lucky playfulness of a normal dog. He no longer needed to lick away the sickness. He could just be a companion. The emotional scars, however, ran much deeper. Chester Ray, the man who had come to the desert seeking peace, found a new purpose. He became Glenda's protector, her friend, and slowly, something more. He courted her with the kind of patience only a man who has seen true horror can possess. He never pushed, never demanded. He would simply sit with her on the porch of the boarding house where she now stayed, talking about the stars, about his time in the cavalry, about the future. He brought her wildflowers he found in the desert canyons and read to her from books he ordered from back east. He was rebuilding her world, one small, kind gesture at a time. One evening, as they sat by the creek where she had once wept in despair, she finally asked him the question that had been on her mind for months. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft. "Why did you help me? No one else did." Chester looked out at the water, shimmering in the moonlight. "Because when I was a scout, I learned that you can't ignore the signs. The land always tells you the truth if you're willing to look. A broken branch, an unnatural silence, a frightened animal. It all means something." He turned to her, his gaze steady and sincere. "I saw the signs with you. The town looked away, but I couldn't. And when I looked closer, I saw a courage in you that puts most soldiers to shame. You survived something that would have broken anyone else." A year later, in the spring, when the desert was carpeted in a riot of colorful blooms, Chester Ray and Glenda Ruth were married. The entire town came. Father Martinez officiated, his blessing a genuine balm on their souls. Leola James was the maid of honor, and Claude Harmon, his face finally free of the deep lines of grief, stood as the best man. Buttons, wearing a small blue ribbon around his neck, served as the ring bearer, trotting proudly down the aisle. The celebration was a symbol of the town's own rebirth. They had faced their darkness and survived. Redemption Creek was finally living up to its name. Leola established a proper clinic, specializing in the care of women, her work becoming known throughout the territory. Claude Harmon, the quiet blacksmith, became the town's unofficial guardian, his forge a sanctuary, and his strength a comfort to anyone in need. He never married, dedicating his life to making sure no one would ever suffer in silence the way his sister had. The town learned a hard lesson. They learned that evil doesn't always come with horns and a pitchfork. Sometimes it wears a smile and a clerical collar. They learned that true faith isn't about looking up at the heavens and ignoring the suffering right in front of you. It's about listening for the quietest whispers of pain, even the desperate whimper of a little dog, and answering with courage, compassion, and justice. The story of Glenda Ruth and her faithful dog became a local legend, a reminder that the deepest wounds can heal, that the darkest secrets cannot survive the light, and that even in the harshest desert, hope can bloom. If you were on the edge of your seat through this story of darkness and redemption, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. You won't want to miss the next strange, dark, and mysterious story we uncover together.